Place your advance order now on Amazon for the very first volume of the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series, Is There Life After Death? Publication date is June 1st.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the topic of Theodicy. Theodicy is the theological justification of how an omniscient and omnipotent deity would allow a world that includes great evil. My guest is Charles Upton. His first two books of poetry, Panic Grass in 1968 and Time Raid in 1969, were published by City Lights in San Francisco, known for publishing the works of the great Beat poets. And I suppose he was thought of in his day as the youngest of the Beat generation of poets. He subsequently became engaged in metaphysics and the traditionalist movement and is author of many books, including Folk Metaphysics, Mystical Meanings in Traditional Folk Songs and Spirituals, Knowings in the Arts of Metaphysics, Cosmology, and the Spiritual Path, The Science of the Greater Jihad, Essays in Principial Psychology, The System of the Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age, Vectors of the Counter-Initiation, The Course and Destiny of Inverted Spirituality, The Alien Disclosure Deception, The Metaphysics of Social Engineering. Charles lives in Lexington, Kentucky, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Charles. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Yeah, glad to be back from wherever I was.
Well, amongst other things, I gather during the Ramadan period, you didn't wish to participate in interviews.
Yeah, it's one added stress, and you need all of your presence of mind for daily stuff. You don't have presence of mind to spare. So,
well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I think the term theodicy is one that probably most of our viewers are not familiar with. I did attempt to define it a little bit in the introduction, but I know it's a very rich and deep term.
Essentially, how do I make it simple? Theodicy is the science or the theological process of answering the following question. How could or why would an all-good and an all-powerful God create a world full of suffering? It doesn't seem to make sense. It does not make sense to a lot of people. That's why people, number one, have a difficulty with the personal aspect of God, because if he, if we call him he as a person, why would he do this? If he's all good, he would create a world that's all good. If he's all powerful, but not all good, then he might just create any damn world that he felt like and not care, about the people in it. So it makes it difficult for people to see, to have a personal relationship to God, because why did you do that? Why did you kill my child? If you are all powerful, and So either people go toward looking at God as a force, like in Star Wars, or natural law, or something that just operates, because, and you can't have a personal relationship with, or they will start to consider that God is, being all powerful is rather formidable and weird and perhaps half evil, and so you get closer and closer to looking at God as something like Satan. The crazier the world gets, the more painful and more suffering and more dangerous the world gets, the more people will say, well, maybe God is kind of like Satan, or some will go all the way and say, well, maybe Satan is God. This is the problem if you don't answer that question that Theodicy poses. So it actually can be answered, I think, pretty well, but people in the churches don't tend to deal with that a lot. They try to say, just have faith, because they can't quite make the arguments. The arguments are all there, but sometimes they don't know them, So I remember there was a very liberal, I was in a liberal Presbyterian church. My wife and I were elders of a little liberal Presbyterian church that was working in the sanctuary movement for Central American refugees. So we were sort of a social activist, social justice church, And one of the principals in that church said one time, he said, who was, a liberal minister, he said, I think God is weak. He's got good intentions, his heart is in the right place, but when it comes to dealing with the evil of the world, he falls down. He can't deal with it any better than I can. Because he was a liberal, and liberals in those days tended to say, we have good intentions, but we're weak. That's one way. And then, the other way is that people think that God is half evil. Carl Jung almost got to that in Answer to Job. He wanted to say, we have to understand God has a formidable aspect. Well, that's true. That's certainly true. But it's hard to trust in God and take refuge in God if you think he's half evil, right? So this is a problem for a lot of people nowadays. And, in easier times when somebody could write a poem and say, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world, when that was a feeling that didn't seem immediately absurd to anybody who heard it, this question receded into the background. But now it's in the foreground. If you're going to believe in God, you're going to have to deal with what the hell is going on in this universe he created. So anyway, that's so simply Theodicy, I would say, in another short definition, is to quote John Milton from Paradise Lost, it is the study or the science of justifying the ways of God to men. So I'm going to start by reading a short thing here that has to do with that, and this is called The Reason for Darkness. So this is something I hope to publish someday soon in a book with other things like it. The sole reason for spiritual darkness is to learn to see and know God in that darkness. In the words of Psalm 139, if I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. It is easy to see him in the light, but if you can see him in the darkness, then you have come to the deepest seeing. As it says in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, his light shone in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The sole purpose of suffering is to know the joy of love in the midst of suffering. This is the deepest love, a love which is only possible if we know all love as from God and to God. In the words of the Hadith Qudsi, which once again is a tradition in Islam where Allah himself speaks, not in the Quran, but just in one day the Prophet said, Allah just said to me X. So in the words of the Hadith Qudsi, I was a hidden treasure who longed to be known, So I created the universe that I might be known. This is the entire reason for the creation and assumption of the veil for human birth into this world. There is even a station at which evil and darkness and suffering are understood as the crucible, the necessary limit that allows or even forces the presence of God in the spiritual heart to deepen and concentrate until it becomes incandescent, thereby opening the door to a world where evil and darkness and suffering can never come. Here we can see how gratitude to the all-merciful for everything that he sends, light or darkness, is not a case of beaten resignation, but the final result of the realization that, quote, all things work together for good to them that love God. Romans 8:28. If we can really see, not just believe, that everything comes from God, then we can take anything. We can allow ourselves to be reduced to a lump of coal and then let the lump be squeezed in God's fist until it becomes a diamond. By undergoing this transformation in the darkest of times, in human history, we will have participated in eternity's deepest self-actualization. We will have forged realizations and values and treasures and essences that no golden age could ever match. In the words of the Gospel according to St. Matthew, this is how take up your cross and follow me becomes my yoke is easy and my burden light. Or in the Surah Al-Inshirah of the Holy Quran, as that says it, behold, with hardship goeth ease. With hardship goeth ease. The ease doesn't just come after the hardship. It is already there, right in the center of it. So,
beautiful words. That's very moving, I have to say. It's like we've already answered the problem now.
Well, yeah, I mean, that gives the feeling, I can make it a little more, step-by-step argument, but that gives the feeling. Or W.B. Yeats, gives the feeling of it when he says, love is like the lion's tooth, So all of this, this is why I have an appreciation for, the spirit of Spain before it got so damn European, when it was just Spain bullfighting, and love and death and romance and all of that stuff,
Well, the very idea of theodicy implies that there is going to be a rational answer, that somehow we, mere humans, are able to comprehend the deity through rationality.
Well, the answer comes probably from higher than rationality, but it can be expressed in rational terms. Once you get it sort of intuitively, then you can parse it out and say, this is how A relates to B. I'm not sure you can argue up from faithlessness to faith. You can never really do that. Once faith is there, it can be expressed, in a reasonably rational terms.
I know, having been raised Jewish, that the problem of theodicy is very real for Jewish people.
Yes, since the Holocaust, for sure. Probably always. But the answer is the Book of Job. I mean, that's got it. That's got it. That's one of the greatest works of theodicy, that's ever appeared. So, and it might feel strange because, it starts, the devil has been cruising around in the world. And then since he's still one of the sons of God, sort of the black sheep of the family, he ends up, in the court of Jehovah, of Yahweh. And Yahweh says, what have you been up to? And he says, well, I've been cruising around in the world, checking things out. And, if you have, says God, look at my servant Job. Isn't he faithful? Isn't he, you claim that you always see the dark side of human beings and you see their weaknesses. But look at him. Look how well he's doing. And Satan says, just let me test him. Just let me take away all his rewards that you've given him for his piety to you. Take away his house, his lands, his flocks, his family, his health. Then see what he does. And Allah says, all right, because I trust Job that he will remain faithful to me, even though you do all these things to him. So go do your worst, and you will see that he has true faith. And so Job says, Satan says, okay, I'll do as you permit. And Job finally ends up in the midst of his suffering say, though he slay me, I will trust in him, but I will maintain mine own ways before him. Which, though he slay me, I will trust in him. That's one thing. You say, well, I will reduce, I will deny myself. I will deny who I am. I will, let you abase me to the point where I'm not even myself. And he said, no, I'm not going to go that far, because he's made me who I am. And so my way of being faithful to him is not just to accept anything he sends, but to accept who he's made me to be. I'm not going to deny that, because denying that would be denying him, because he created me. So that's the best book. You want Theodicy, you read Job.
It's a wonderful book, but as I recall, Carl Jung, in the answer to Job, took a very different point of view. I think he felt that God deserves to be criticized for the way he treated Job.
Well, Jung had a problem, with religion. I mean, he had a problem with his father. His father was, a very, was a mainstream, an idealistic mainstream Protestant who had to deny so much of the hard edge of life that he lost his faith, but wouldn't admit it. That's pretty much where his father was. And a lot of Jung's psychology was a reaction to say, I don't want to end up like my father. I want to look at the dark side. I want to look at the shadow. And, and he did a lot of wonderful work looking at the shadow, but, he lost the other side, I mean, his shadow was his father. That's what he didn't integrate, right?
In the Jewish tradition, I understand that sometimes it's considered the right thing to do to argue with God, not to take everything that God says at face value. The very name Israel means one who wrestles with God.
Wrestles with the angel, with God. Yeah. So yeah. Well, okay, and that's a real way. I mean, knowing that you can't win, and knowing that you can't prove God wrong, but you have to maintain your own ways before him. And if it looks, why did you do that? Why? How could you allow this? It's right. It's right to ask that question. I know that's more a Jewish thing than a Muslim thing. Once in a while, the Muslims, say, I mean, we have a prayer we do in Sufis, and even if I disagree with you or something like this, I do not deny you. So, that's a possibility, but certainly it's more true among Jews.
There's the story, for example, of Sodom and Gomorrah, and God is ready to destroy these cities because of their iniquities. And Abraham starts to bargain with them, to the point where Abraham, if I recall, he says, if there's 10 good men, do you still want to destroy the city?
Lot. It was Lot.
Lot.
And if I find you, 10 honest, 10 good men, will you spare the city? Or 5 or 2, and it went down. Yeah. Well, and because as long as we realize that God already knows that we will struggle with him, and he is, he is before us and behind us, both in space and time and in spirit, and we can't get around him. He's already gotten around us, and yet we can't see that. And if we can't see that, we got to admit it. We got to be who we are on the level of what we actually see. Otherwise, we're lying to ourselves and we're lying to him. So it's real. The struggle with God is a real thing. Yeats said, he with body waged a fight, but body won, it walks upright. Then he struggled with his heart, innocence and peace depart. Then he struggled with his mind, his proud heart he left behind. Now his wars on God begin. At stroke of midnight, God shall win. So that's, yeah.
With regard to the problem of theodicy, it's based on a premise. The premise is that God is omniscient and omnipotent.
All good.
Yes, all good. That's what the name God means in the ancient Anglo-Saxon.
Exactly.
We have these ideas, but where do they come from? I'm not sure you find it, for example, in the Bible. Maybe it's in the Quran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The name of God, the beneficent, the merciful. In the Quran, it says, you can call God Allah, but it's equally right to call him Al-Rahim, the all-merciful. So that's where God is all good. And there's no question that he's all-powerful. That's in every line of the Quran.
I think it's less obvious, perhaps, in the Judeo-Christian tradition. I know it's well accepted, but I've always assumed it didn't come because God said, I am all-powerful, I am all good. Although perhaps in the Quran, that's exactly what you have.
Well, it's more explicit in the Quran. It doesn't come to mind immediately in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but I'm sure. It was so you tend to have the split between the all-powerful God of the Old Testament and the all-good God of the New Testament, which is not a real split, but it's a change in emphasis.
Some people use the arguments associated with theodicy to argue, I suppose you could say in reverse, because evil exists, therefore God cannot be all good, cannot be all powerful.
Well, yeah, here's where the actual arguments may be helpful. And that's what Jung did. So it goes something like this. Okay, God creates the universe. He creates all things, and he creates hierarchically. He first creates, let us say, the nous, or the first intellect, or the first motion of subject and object, where it's possible to contemplate God, to say, there is God, I know God through God, but yet there's a duality is beginning. And then it goes down, and you have the archangelic world, and then the world of the lower angels, then the psychic world of all the possible states of consciousness of all the sentient beings in the universe, and then the subtle material world where the jinn and the UFOs actually operate, and then the material world which we perceive with our five senses. And it's a step, it steps down, 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 down. And each time it steps down, there's a greater veil because, as the Quran says, Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. Well, the light is veiled by the first even knowledge of him outside of his essence. And then it's veiled more as each lower world is reached. And so what happens is, each time there's a veil, there's a mixture of darkness with that light. Not all of the light gets through. And why does it have to be that? Well, if there's going to be a world, there has to be a degree of darkness, privation, lack. Because if the world were simply flooded with the total light of God, it would disappear. It would be God. There would be no world. There would be no creation. So if there's going to be dimensional creation and different beings and things we go through in this world, and struggles and achievements and sufferings and joys and all of this, there has to be a mixture of darkness, because otherwise everything would just be subsumed into the light and there would be no world. So that's why darkness, why evil, if you will, is necessary for there to be a world. So what that means is when in this world, we have a world of light and darkness, which means it is a world of choice, and it's a world of alternatives, of yes and no. And so you say, why are we born into this world if the world we came from is so perfect? With some near-death experiencers also remember what it was like before they were born, and it was so perfect. You know that near death, I've heard this story told by more than one place, someone who remembered his existence before being born into this world, and he's there with the other beings of light, and he encounters one who's just more glorious than the rest, and he said, "How did you ever become this?" And the being says, "Well, I went to this place called Earth, and I went through what you go through on Earth, and when I came back, I had gained this degree of glory." And the other spirit says, "Wow, I'd like to go there too." The first one says, "Better watch out. It's kind of difficult." But through the struggles and the sufferings of Earth, you can gain in greater glory. So that's one way to talk about it. So there is that, and then when you get to a certain point, choice becomes necessary. In the higher worlds, the Muslims look at the angels as incapable of sinning or falling or rebelling against God because they're just like beams of light coming out of the sun. And how can a beam of light continue to exist when it's cut off from the sun? It can't. So there's no idea that an angel can fall. Whereas Christians, for other real reasons, I think, can see that angelic beings can rebel. But there is just that light. But if you get to lower levels, then suddenly there are alternatives between light and darkness. That this is what happens in eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The alternatives appear. Before, it was all the tree of life. Everything was an expression of God. Everything was life. And then the serpent comes and says, "Yes, but there's this other thing, and you can learn even more stuff, and you can be like God." And so they eat the fruit, and suddenly they're in alternatives. They have to choose now. Everything is partial. The wholeness of things is broken. They have to choose the good over the evil, even if the evil has something to recommend it. They better choose the better over the worse, or they're going to go to hell. And we all know that's true. There's always some good in sin. There's pleasure, power, or something that is a positive good, except it's in a dark set. And if we go for that, we're going to end up, in the pit. So we've got to choose the better over the worse. But that's a great come down from the time when everything was just, was all the glory of God, and it was all one. The Zohar, talks about, remember in Exodus, Moses goes up the mountain, he comes back with the law, but he sees that the children of Israel are worshiping the golden calf, and so he gets angry, he breaks the tablets of the law, then he has to go back and get a second set of tablets. And the Zohar says about that, the first set of tablets was the Torah of the tree of life, in which everything is good. Everything is permitted because everything is good, and here is, but the human race in its present condition couldn't stand a law like that, because what it would mean to fall in humanity is, hey man, we get to do anything we want. Too much, and that of course would lead, to terrible consequences. So that those tablets had to be broken. You had to go back and get, okay, now we're in the world of good and evil, and in the world of good and evil, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, shalt not, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the law that was necessary to us given our condition. So the Catholics say, well, God, doesn't send evil. He sends good. He doesn't send evil, but he permits it, which is a good thing to say up to a point, because now we're in free will. And, when it comes to sin, he permits sin because he wants us to participate in his freedom. He wants us to be free with his freedom, and that cannot be without free will. But with that comes the danger of making the wrong choice, of misuse of free will. So there's something to that. But what about volcanoes and earthquakes and stuff like that? Is that the misuse of free will by nature? I don't think so. What that is another level or type of evil, which is more, I think, correctly addressed by Islam in the Quran. The Quran will say, you see, I've got these three things here. That Allah sends everything, whether good or evil. And then you also find that in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. There's nothing, you don't, at one point you have to say, well, God is all good, therefore evil must come from something else. And then you say, well, like the bad stuff comes from the devil. Yeah. Okay, well, that's necessary to prevent you from doing what Jung did, is saying God is half evil, right? But ultimately, it doesn't work. You need that for a while, but then the point comes where you have to say, but if he's all powerful, then everything comes from him. What we consider to be good, what we consider to be evil, all comes from him. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with that? Well, you deal with that in two different ways, or according to two different texts. One is, it's a hadith, and it says his mercy precedes his wrath. He's both merciful and wrathful. He is Al-Rahman, the all-merciful. He's Al-Jamal, the beautiful. But he's also Al-Jalal, the majestic, the rigorous, the terrible. And all of that comes from Allah. But his mercy has precedence. And he is both, definitely, but his mercy has precedence. And because his mercy has precedence, because the closer we get to his essence, the closer we get to mercy. And the farther away we get from him out into circumstances that are all coming from him still. But the farther we get out into circumstances and into the complexities of the world, the more we're subjected to his wrath. So the idea, if we want to leave his wrath and return to his mercy, we need to return to his essence. And that is why it's possible for the Quran to say there is no refuge from Allah but in him. We take refuge from him in his outer manifestation, which has great difficulties sometimes. And we return to his inner reality, which is pure mercy. And that's why we can say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the beneficent, the merciful. So that's how the Muslims deal with theodicy.
Well, the poem that you read when we began our discussion seemed to suggest the point of view that suffering, pain, evil, that these things actually have a positive value. I think what you said is that the closest we can get to God is when we are in our suffering.
Well, yes, but you don't want to say that easily. Because, I know what I do when I suffer. I say, stop, take it away. And that's what almost everybody does. And yet there's a point where, if God willing, and if our faith is deep enough, we may get a moment of understanding that suffering is a deepening experience. But I would never say that glibly, because suffering is suffering and everybody knows how bad that is.
And then there's the question I think many of the critics bring up, not necessarily the suffering of you or me or some adult who is on a spiritual path. We're talking about the suffering often of innocent children and animals, and it's very hard to justify that.
Children will pass on the next world and become fully adult, if you will, like they were before they were born. And perhaps that question will be answered then, God willing. Animals is interesting. I don't know what to say about animals. Animals are on their way to humanity. I have that feeling. They're working toward contributing something to the human form in some later stage of development, or human, or perhaps in another world. And I always see, it's weird. My cat Juniper, who died some years ago, after he died, I had dreams of him. And once he appeared as a page, a page boy, like which is actually the lowest of the grades in the feudal system. It goes page, squire, knight, and baronet or whatever up to monarch. And so he was like a neophyte. Neophyte is an interesting word. It means a seedling. It means a sprout, a little sprout, And he was just starting out in his spiritual development. And and I would have times where I would connect with him and sort of talk to him after he passed on. But then I was there and I saw him as a little page boy, and I was trying to connect with him and say, come and talk to me. And he said, don't call me back. I'm learning to talk, which means he was learning to develop a human faculty. So something in his little soul was ultimately going to contribute that little juniperness to the totality of the human form, and it was working in that direction. So I don't know what that says about suffering, but the other strange thing is I dreamt that he was the angel, or was related to the angel Sandalphon. And Sandalphon is the angelic form of the prophet Elijah. Now, I don't know, how could that be? That's weird. I don't remember if I even knew that before. I may have heard the name Sandalphon, but I forgot what it was. But I looked it up and I said, oh yeah, that's that. After Elijah rises in his fiery chariot, he becomes Sandalphon in the higher world. And my cat, what is, it's just, little intimations that there's more to this whole life and death thing than we usually think.
As a parapsychologist and one engaged in psychical research, I think there's good empirical evidence for an afterlife. But even if there were not, I think from the theological point of view, you would want to have it in order to establish God's justice.
Yes, exactly. Because this is the use of the belief in reincarnation. He said, why was I born with these handicaps, or why did this terrible person die with no punishment? And you say, well, it was because of stuff you did in a former lifetime, and his next lifetime is going to be problematic because of what he did in this one. That's one way to answer that question. I don't entirely disagree with reincarnation. I just don't think it's like little Charles Upton dies and turns into some other little person in another lifetime who turns into another. There's more to it than that. There are many lives that have a relationship to each other in a very deep way, but, and reincarnation is one way to talk about it. But I tend to think it's more centering to talk about one's eternal destiny, because you get seriouser, about your spiritual life. At least I do when I think of things that way.
I know you kind of hinted at this a little earlier, but I'm under the impression that one of the major Christian theodicies is the idea that evil isn't real. Evil is simply the absence of good, that the only thing that exists is goodness and its absence.
Yeah, that's true, but you can't say it's a mere lack of good. That mere, I always say, death by starvation, don't worry, it's just a mere lack of food. It's a pretty serious thing, although it's obviously a lack. So I think when Jung thought that the seriousness, the rigor of evil was being easily dismissed by saying, oh, it's a mere privatio boni, a mere, lack of the good. I maybe that's the way his father thought. I don't know, but obviously, what could be worse than a lack of the good? That's hell. That's got all the rigor and the darkness that you could ever want.
But it gives God sort of an out, or at least your vision of God, that God is not responsible for the evil in the world, only for the good. And I understand, I could correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't that viewpoint go back to St. Augustine?
I think so, yeah. But I mean, the question is, well, and at that point you say, well, the Catholics say God, created man perfect and placed him in paradise, and then man misused his free will and fell, and so it's all your fault. That's the way they deal with that. But then, of course, he placed man in a condition, even though it was participating in his own perfection. It had the serpent. It had the possibility of the misuse of free will. And so somebody's going to misuse free will. That's so let's say at that point you refer it back to God and say, why did you put the serpent in the garden? What's the serpent? Why did we have to have that? And then God would say, you wanted to exist apart from me. You wanted to be yourself. You wanted to say, I am I, and I am Adam, and Eve is Eve, and all these other people are them, and we wanted to be individuals. And since you wanted that, I granted your request. I told you that it would have some dark consequences, but I also saw that it would teach you things that you couldn't learn any other way. And since you wanted it, I said yes. So that's God's response to our challenge to him.
Can we talk for a moment about the Gnostics? If I understand it correctly, many of the varied schools of Gnosticism have the idea that the being who is responsible for this planet isn't the real God, it's some kind of a counterfeit God.
Yeah. Well, it's understandable that people would be attracted to Gnosticism. I certainly was at one point. Yeah. In one school of Gnosticism, I forget which, calls, it's the evil demiurge, Yaldabaoth. Isn't that an awful name? Yaldabaoth. The blind, deluded, evil God created this crazy world because he thought he was God, but he didn't know what the hell he was doing, and he created a deficient world. And so the heavens of this world do not declare the glory of God, nor does the earth show forth his handiwork, because this is all created by a false God. So there's no good in this world. The beauty of nature is all a sham. The human love, all a sham. Only the absolute, transcendent, alien God is where goodness resides. And so we have to say no to this world. And there's two ways of saying no to this world according to the Gnostics. One is through absolute asceticism, like the Cathars, for example, who would starve themselves to death when they became, pure enough to do it. They would starve themselves to death, and say no. They would receive no sustenance from this world. They would not eat the fruits of the earth. They all they want to do is die and return to the absolute, transcendent, alien God who is alien to this world. Interesting. I'm just wondering the relationship between the Gnostic idea of the alien God and the UFO religion that worships the aliens. We could talk about that another time. But and the other way, according to other Gnostic sects, to say no to the world is to break all the rules. Is to be a complete, whatever moral rule there is, break it. Make it a responsibility of yours, no matter how hard it might be, to break all the moral rules, because they are all created by the false God that created this world. Talk about Gnosticism. There was recently that Christian cult, they call it. What was it? The International Church of something, I forget, in Kenya, where all these people would go out to the woods and starve themselves to death because, that way they could return to God. So you really have a Gnostic tendency, coming out again. And you have that in a world like this where it looks like the world is created by a false God because there's so much darkness in it, and at one point I had what I would call the cosmic paranoia of the Gnostics. And I was looking and said, this world is not just evil and painful, but it's a lie, and it's a cunningly contrived system of lies, in order to lead us all astray. And who's behind this? What archons are behind this crazy world? And I really did look at things that way for a while. Yeah. And so I think the Gnostics are great when you want to analyze, you analyze the fall, you analyze the fallen order of perception that the human soul and the human consciousness has come into to project a world like this. And the Gnostics do have something to say about that. What they don't see is that behind all of this is mysteriously also a face of mercy. The Gnostic error is to accept the transcendence of God, which is true, but to deny the immanence of God in all things. And that's where they go wrong.
Well, that I think was well put. I have the impression that this branch of Gnosticism is sort of the root of all other conspiracy theories.
Well, more and more people are saying that. Interestingly, the root of all heresies, or the root. Yeah, conspiracy theory is a basically Gnostic way of looking at things. It's very interesting. I was just contacted by some guy who shall remain nameless, who has done 35 hours of videos on YouTube, which were just kicked off of YouTube for bullying or something, whatever their rules. And he was putting together all of the conspiracy theories that anyone has ever heard of and putting them in the context of Muslim eschatology, basically more from a Shia position than not. And I was thinking, incredible, and he says, and he was using, dramatic footage of the kind that would sensationalistic footage that would apply to appeal to people nowadays. He had something, he lifted from The Lord of the Rings and all this, and it's very interesting stuff. But I saw at one point he wasn't making enough of a distinction between exposing the lies that the evil ones are telling us and believing the lies that the evil ones are telling us. He had them mixed up. And at one point, for all the interesting stuff he came up with, he was saying, well, actually, God creates the Mohammedan light, which is the pleroma, which is a Gnostic concept. It's the higher world of light. And then this is veiled by the first intellect. Okay, that's all right. And the first intellect casts a shadow. I was sort of saying something like that myself just now. But the shadow is the evil demiurge who is Satan. And then that's okay. It's a little dicey, and then he says, and Satan is neutral because he's merely an absence of light, and so Satan can be used for a positive purpose. Whoa, and he says all things after that arise from Satan and are trying to return to God in the pleroma. Whoa, here's where he becomes not only a Gnostic but a Satanist, and so I had to say sorry. I had to finally block him because very heavy to encounter this guy. So it's hard. It was almost the point where I saw, look, this conspiracy theory thing has a limit. It's interesting, it's necessary, but if you put all your eggs in that basket, you will go astray.
One of the characteristics of Gnosticism, the one that first caught my attention, is the idea of gnosis, the idea of a direct, intuitive encounter with the deity. You described it earlier as a personal relationship with God, and that seems somehow to be very different than the idea of this sort of imposter God.
Well, yeah, gnosis is not limited to Gnosticism. I mean, there are a lot of Christians who will just, they will call anything Gnostic that they think is wrong theologically. They will call paganism, that loves nature and believes in Gaia and all this. They call that Gnosticism, which is wrong. That's as far from Gnosticism as Christianity is. That's something that concentrates on the immanence of God and forgets his transcendence. That's the opposite problem. But, so gnosis, Irenaeus, the church father, he was one of the major critics of the Gnostics, and yet he spoke of a Christian gnosis. He used the word gnosis. It means a direct knowledge of God. And you will find in St. Paul the idea of gnosis, that we know God intimately and directly. And if Christianity doesn't result in that kind of intimacy, then it hasn't worked out, So I don't know. It's too bad that the idea of gnosis has got associated with Gnosticism, because one of the ways it's used in Gnosticism is, well, there's an explicit alternate doctrine that you have to know. And if you know that, then you were enlightened. If you accept the story of the fall of the Sophia and the creation of of this false world by the evil demiurge and the operation of the archons and all, if you know all that stuff, then you've got gnosis. Well, and there may have been true Gnostics in the sense of those who wanted and attained intimacy with God, that they might have existed in the Gnostic, in the world of the sectarian Gnostics. I'm not saying they didn't, but you can't say, well, that's the Gnostic, that the Gnostics are the esoterics that really know the mystical secrets, whereas the Christians are just the other Christians, the Orthodox Christians are just the moralists who don't really know that deeper stuff. You can't say that. Now, there is a tendency in Christianity, which sometimes goes too far, as to say, well, we warn against intellectual pride, so don't ask about these deeper mysteries, because that's intellectual pride. Well, what that is intellectual cowardice, actually. Of course, we ask about the deeper mysteries. If Christ came and went through all that, to redeem us, he certainly redeemed our minds and our inner consciousness as well. And if Christianity doesn't give you access to the mysteries on one level, then it didn't work. But of course it does. There's just a misunderstanding of identifying of the esoteric aspects of Christianity with the sectarian Gnostics, which is not warranted, because there's plenty of that in Orthodox Christianity, in the fathers and doctors of the church, in the great mystics, if you know where to look.
Well, in Islam, you have the Sufi tradition, which you are familiar with and involved in. And I gather there's a similar tension between the Sufis and the Orthodox Muslims about the role of gnosis.
Yes, there is. Because there's a tendency, there's always been a tendency, and it's very strong in Islam right now, is to limit the Quran to, on the one hand, just a set of rules which are to be followed, which are, of course, very important, and all legitimate Sufis will say this. It's necessary to follow Sharia as the basis for the mystical path. But they'll say, well, there's only Sharia, there's only what you do and what you don't do. That's it. And, if you look for something deeper, then you're on the way to heresy, and maybe you got it from the Christians, or maybe you got it from the Buddhists, or maybe you got it from the shamans, but it's not Islam. Well, to say that is not Islam. There's always been in deeper mysteries, and if you know how to read the Quran, I mean, the first thing, it just looks rather formidable and rule oriented and stuff, but it says things so swiftly. It says something so fast you don't even catch it. But if you go back to that phrase, there's no refuge from Allah but in Him. Do you know the depths of something like that? That can lead to a library of speculation, if you want to speculate on it, mystically. And the Quran is filled with mystical secrets all the way through. And, the Sufis tend to concentrate on that. Yeah.
The question of theodicy is, to my knowledge, is mostly a formal question for theologians. That seems to be where that question is lodged. I understand, for example, the term theodicy was originated by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was a scientist and philosopher. So it's a logical exercise. Does it have a place in the Sufi world?
Well, it has a place in the spiritual life. In other words, it has a place in life. You do ask, I mean, one of my Sufi brothers during Ramadan, he's a driver for Uber, and he's trying to get a better deal. He's in New York. He's trying to get a Shield. He bought an electric car, and then something failed in his application for something, and he thought everything was lost, and he went into darkness, and he said, this is terrible. There's no way to fix this. Allah, why did you do this? Well, I accept whatever you do, and if I have to suffer more, then fine. But he was in a dark space, and for a moment he said he almost lost his faith, which I've never heard him say before. And then something came to him and says, well, why don't you just go down to the office and ask if this could be fixed? So he went down to the right office, and the guy said, oh, no, that's no problem. That's just a little glitch. We can take care of that. And then suddenly, boom, he said, Allah, thank you. So in other words, this is someone who does nothing but drive his Uber and do his spiritual practices for hours and drive his Uber. And then meet with us on Zoom, and that this is his life. And so, I mean, the difficulties of life confront you with theodicy. If you believe in God, and you will find not just suffering, but you'll find things that seem to be. Sometimes you'll think God is plotting against you. Why did you tricked me? You will say, you tricked me. You gave me to believe that if I did this, everything would work out, and then you took it all away. What are you up to? This is just life to someone who has faith in God and yet is struggling with contingencies and difficulties. That's So yeah. I mean, in terms of a formal argument, it's philosophical and theological. But in terms of life, that's what anybody who believes in God, you pray for your loved one not to die, and you've seen in the past miracles maybe, and you prayed and they didn't die, or someone else was saved by a lot of prayer, and then they die, and you say, why didn't it work this time? Those are the questions that are posed to you by life. And if you believe in God, you're going to have to deal with theodicy of one kind or another at one point.
I know the Roman philosopher Seneca, whom I admire quite a bit, came up with a theodicy of sorts of his own, which is that, similar to what you said, that there's a positive good to suffering. And I know you find that actually in many religious traditions, but Seneca went so far as to say, I really pity people who have never suffered.
If you can find them. But yeah, and I remember that there was, I forget the guy's name, but he was a great correspondent writing on Vietnam War, and he wrote, I think it was in something like The Atlantic years ago, he wrote his thing on Vietnam, and he said, one thing he said, I saw that you are as responsible for what you see as for what you do. But also he was quoting some guy who'd been through the ringer in Vietnam and survived. And the soldier, discharged soldier, said to him, he said, like, what did war put you through? What was your experience? And he said, it peeled me, man. I'm smooth now. In other words, a lot of neurotic, childish, selfish suffering has to go when the real suffering comes. All of that nonsense we fill our lives with, you do get purified of that. Definitely.
I understand that you have another poem.
This is kind of a longer meditation, and this is dealing with something like Theodicy, but in the context of apocalypse, which we're all talking about nowadays, because, here's the possibility of nuclear war, here's, global warming becoming serious, and everything else that we're facing now. And so I tried to write something which would talk about how to basically deal with this on hopefully a practical way of dealing with it. Not just a theory of apocalypse, but how we put it to use. Can we put it to use? Can we put these hard times to use? We better ask that question. So let me see. How long is it? 1, 2. Well, it's actually 3 3/4 pages of 12-point single-spaced Roman Microsoft Word.
Mm-hmm. Well, it could be 15, 20 minutes worth.
Oh, yeah. So I'll read it if that's not too long.
It'll be fine.
Okay, good. All right. So I'll see how this goes. This is called The Practice of Apocalypse. And it's got a note at the beginning. It says, this text was written from the standpoint of traditional eschatology, so it will speak most directly to those who are traveling a traditional spiritual path. But since no one is immune to the apocalyptic energies of our times, it may also have something to say to those who are armed only with a basic goodwill and a degree of spiritual sensitivity. I hope it will prove useful to anyone who views it, but I caution my listeners against taking it as a sufficient way of dealing on a spiritual level with the terrors and deceptions of the end times. Eschatology is not a spiritual path in itself, and what is required of the human being before God is the same in every age. Nonetheless, the present text does deal with a spiritual orientation that is rarely considered, the possibility of taking the intense stresses of apocalyptic events as a catalyst for the purification and alchemical transmutation of the soul. In other words, as grace. So it goes like this. When the whole earth descends into darkness, when the entire human race is lost in the shadow of despair, when every false hope openly displays and proves its intrinsic falsity, when each man and woman is forced to reveal the true idol that he or she worships and to live out the full consequences of that worship. This is the reign of Al-Dajjal, the Antichrist. This is the day when every idol bows down to the ultimate idol and pays tribute to him. This is the kingdom of smoke, the great singularity, the thick and palpable darkness. There is no breath of life, no light of knowledge in it. The ear is blocked from hearing even its own voice, much less the voices of any other living things. The hand, even when held directly before the face, cannot be seen. The only way through the wall of darkness on that day is by two questions. The first is, by what light is this shadow, this darkness cast? And the second is, what is the name and the nature of the opaque object which interrupts that light, such that this impenetrable shadow is thrown like a net of hopeless paralysis over the entire world? The name of that light is God in the shape of Omega, the Messiah of the final days, the Christ of the Parousia, the prophet Jesus on the eve of the hour, and Al-Qaim al-Mahdi, his herald, the one who is also Maitreya, Kalki, and Saoshyant. And the name of the opaque object that blocks that light is Al-Dajjal, the Antichrist, he who is none other than the outward manifestation of the totality of the human ego, both inner and outer, both individual and collective. When the true light dawns, that ego completely constellates and rises up against it. René Guénon said, first materialism petrifies the carapace of the world, Blake's mundane shell, making it hard and brittle. Secondly, cracks begin to appear in that carapace, cracks in the downward direction, which open the door to the infrapsychic, to Yajuj and Majuj, Gog and Magog. The rise of these infrapsychic forces is recounted in the 9th chapter of the book of Revelations, verses 1-3, as follows. And the 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven into the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. But in the third and final act, another crack opens up, this time in the upper direction. It is through this aperture that the rider on the white horse descends, the prophet Jesus, as announced by the Mahdi, the Christ of the second coming, with his bride, the heavenly Jerusalem, who is the new heaven and the new earth. This opening is preceded by a powerful increase in angelic activity, which those who remain sensitive to celestial influences will be able to discern, indicating that the host of heaven, whose emblems are the wheeling stars, have arrived to do battle with Lucifer and his legions. Lucifer, who, though he is indeed a fallen angelic being, or perhaps, as the Muslims say, a jinn who had once been admitted to the ranks of the angels, is equally the prototype of the human ego on the deepest level, now outwardly manifesting as the Antichrist. As the Antichrist, as Al-Dajjal the deceiver, who is the archive of all the toxic psychic residues of the whole Manvantara, the entire world age now coming to an end, that world ruler who cannot stand in the face of truth, the one to whom love is a torturing fire. When the darkness is intense, when the lie is complete and established, when no light can be seen or sensed anywhere in this world, now is the time when the human soul can turn completely to the light of God, to Allah, who is the light of the heavens and the earth. When all breath and motion in the realm of earthly existence has become impossible, this is the time when necessary being can and must dawn, and will dawn, and has now in fact dawned. Now everything has become simple. Now there is nothing the heart can do but turn toward the absolute light. In the words of the Holy Quran, Allah is the protecting guardian of all who believe. He brings them out of darkness into light. As for those who disbelieve, their patrons are the false gods who bring them out of light into darkness. These are the rightful owners of the fire, and that is where they will remain. First, this light appears as something like a smell, then as something resembling a voice, then as a penetrating brilliance. Whoever tries to stand against it will be overthrown by it. Whoever has a heart capable of fully prostrating to it will become a bridge for it from that world into this world, a road for it through the darkness of this world, capable of reaching the living center of every human soul. In the design of the human microcosm, the psychophysical doorway of the absolute light, the way by which it and the angels who herald it can reach the heart, though the properly spiritual doorway is more direct, immediate, and divinely given, is what the Hindus call the Brahmarandra, the aperture of Brahma at the crown of the skull, also represented by the cloven tongues of fire that appeared above the heads of Christ's apostles on Pentecost. It is as if this highest opening were an ear through which, God willing, you will gain the power to hear his word for you and invite it into the depths of your being, the power to listen for light. Therefore, if it seems to the best of your spiritual intuition that God has called you to attend to the angelic realm as it appears in the subtle psychic space above the Brahmarandra, then it would probably be best to begin as soon as humanly possible to watch for what God may do in that dimension. But before all specified methods and techniques and strategies, the turn comes first. In the normal course of things, this turn might take years, even a lifetime. Yet it is always possible, especially under the stress of apocalyptic conditions, that it might happen, as St. Paul said, in the twinkling of an eye. And if you find yourself able to turn to God, know that this is only because he has first turned to you. So your answer is assured. His is the voice. You are only the echo. But in order to accomplish this turn, you must remember once again that the darkness of this world is the outward manifestation of the nafs, the ego, just as the nafs is the inner essence of the dunya, the world. You do not have direct access to the entire battlefield of this world, except as one particle of dust in the gale force winds that blow across it. But you do have direct access with every breath you take to the battlefield of the heart. As Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi said in his esoteric exegesis of the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata, the story of the battle on the field of Kurukshetra between the universal forces of good and evil, Kurukshetra is in the heart of man. By this he recognized the battle that takes place in Kurukshetra as the greater jihad. From one point of view, the unveiling of the face of Allah on the eve of the hour, as initiated by the Advent and in the person of the prophet Jesus, begins in the angelic dimension and descends from the imaginal sky. But it ends in the depths of the heart. When the veils of self and world are removed from the heart one by one, then Allah as Al-Shahid, the absolute witness, is fully revealed. The poet T.S. Eliot, in his poem The Four Quartets, describes this ultimate event as follows, beginning with a quote from St. Julian of Norwich. "And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one." The knot of fire is Allah as the sublime, Al-Ali. The heart is Allah as the essence and the reality, Al-Haq. Al-Dajjal, the Antichrist, now confronts us in the shape of the darkness of this world, the dunya with 1,000 necks. For each neck we sever, 1,000 new heads grow out of it. Where is the Dajjal with only one neck, so it can be cut with a single stroke and his rule of deception ended? The single-necked Dajjal is the rebellious ego, the nafs al-amara bil-su, the self commanding to evil. The only sword sharp enough to cut it is the light of Allah, his beauty and his majesty, his mercy and his justice. Once the eye of the heart opens to steadily gaze upon that light, without the slightest shadow of a self remaining to stand in the way of it, the final stroke has been delivered, the coup de grâce, which means the stroke of grace. The army of the Mahdi cannot be located in the outer world. The prophet Jesus, he announces, will appear neither in the desert of matter nor in the inner chamber of the psyche. He will arise from the core of the heart, deeper than the psyche, and come forward into the outer world as a projection from that heart. As the lightning comes forth from the east, the batin, the inner, and shines even to the west, the zahir, the outer. You can never be strong or clear enough to find him. All you can do is to be humble and submissive enough to become one of the points at which he will finally break through. because your personal contribution to the collective ego, who is Antichrist, has been snuffed out. Once my wife Jenny dreamt of a stunningly beautiful blonde woman in a long red gown standing next to a figure of the globe. The woman said, "Holes will now start to appear in the world, and whatever we put into those holes will become absolutely real." This moment at the first half of 2023 is the precise time when our consensus reality is finally broken down under shock after shock, the time when those holes have begun to appear not just to the sensitives, the visionaries, but to everyone. First, the official acknowledgement of the UFO phenomenon, then COVID, climate change, transgenderism, China, the Ukraine, economic instability, the deconstruction of our political system, the disintegration of our social fabric, and now the universal availability of artificial intelligence appearing as us and speaking for us, as if to obliterate the human voice and face. When self-image plus world image totally shatters, then through the cracks and rifts and bullet holes in what's left of our reality might come anything at all. What will actually come for each of us depends entirely on the direction and quality of our attention. If we are oriented toward chaos, we will get chaos. If we are focused on the devil, we will get the devil. If we are concentrated on God, God will be our inheritance. Those whose obsession is with technology or social ideology or the environment or the economy or this or that probable future or the UFO aliens or some dark and twisted version of the metaphysical absolute, or chaos itself, which is the encompassing matrix of all of these fragments, will have invoked a particular self paired with a particular world, and will inherit all the riches and the poisons, all the truths and illusions of that self and that world. This is not to say that the entire human race will not ultimately undergo the same ordeals, only that the conscious center from which these ordeals are faced will be radically different depending upon one's orientation. If, however, we concentrate beyond any intelligible God image upon God alone, then no world will enclose us and no self will limit us, because the eye through which we see God and the eye through which he sees us will be the same eye. Then all worlds and all selves will be equally available to us precisely because we identify with none of them, but see all of them as they really are, as belonging not to us but to him, being his names and his attributes. Therefore, as the facades of world identity crumble and the masks of self-identity fall, be prepared as soon as the rift opens directly in front of you to release your concentrated spiritual attention like an arrow to the center of the target. Keep a cool eye and a steady hand. And remember, though God sends both good and evil, because without imperfections and contradictions, this world couldn't exist apart from him, God in his essence is not only all-powerful, but all good. In the words of the Hadith Qudsi, my mercy has precedence over my wrath. In the words of the Noble Quran, there is no refuge from God, but in him. So that's that.
I'm so moved, to be honest. That was, I don't want to characterize it because it was so rich and so deep and so meaningful. And Charles, I feel blessed to be able to have a conversation like this with you.
Well, all I'm sure I can do is words. I think I got that one down. But, we just hope that this, when people are confronting what we all have to confront now, whether this could be of help. And it's not of help if people remember God and pray to him, however they conceive of him or her or it, and then this might find a place too,
I can only thank you from the bottom of my heart, Charles, for being with me today. And I'm hopeful that we will have many, many more conversations. Well,
I hope so too. it's so much easier I was going to read that to an insentient computer, and it's so much easier to read it correctly when I'm reading it to someone I know is listening. So.
Anytime you want to read your poetry, I'm happy to be a listener, and I'm also happy to put it out on the New Thinking Aloud channel. And as we discussed earlier, send you a copy for your own purposes.
Well, great. That's very helpful. Appreciate that. So, appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you once again for being with me today, Charles. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you, too, for being with us. The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website